If you haven't already watched part 1 of the story of the Bible, I encourage you to do that before you watch this part. Either due to my lack of skill or YouTube restrictions, I had to split this story of the Bible into 2 parts, which isn't ideal, but that's the way it is. So go back and watch part 1. Here's part 2. Then the Spirit of God moves over yet more water, the Red Sea, as Yahweh leads his people out of Egypt. A pillar of both cloud and fire, separated like the first day of creation, gives light to the Israelites and darkness to the Egyptians. He feeds them with manna, which is described as looking the same way as the precious stones in Eden. In fact, here and in Genesis are the only 2 references in the Old Testament. In the desert, the Creator God of order and life, dispeller of chaos, begins to recreate again. God made another covenant with Moses, a leader God had spared in another ark and raised up to take his people to the promised land. This covenant brought order to practically every aspect of the lives of his people. From the kinds of clothes they wore, to the meals they cooked, to their sex lives, to how they harvested. His glory would be seen in the right ordering of the world he had made, and that included his people. This was good news. The gods of their neighbors never bothered to tell their worshippers about what offended or pleased them. Yahweh, however, made it very clear God and God's will could be known. So Moses and the people took the 10 foundational commandments from God and wrote books about what they would do to bring covenant justice and order to their nation and their lives, to reveal his goodness to the world. These books of the law were the kind of law text found throughout the ancient world. These were wise guidelines, commentary to accompany the primary text on stone tablets. Wisdom literature, if you will, the kind that would guide Solomon as he made decisions in unexpected ways. But it was more than that. Unlike their neighbors, the Jewish people did not have to guess what guidelines would please the gods. Yahweh told them. These wise law texts set the standard for covenant life, and they set the limits of lex talionis punishment. In other words, the punishment showed the limits of retributive justice. These laws also practiced provisions of mercy, which typically took the form of a substitutionary atonement for sin, such as a fine. In other words, the people knew what a crime deserved, but they also knew that their just God, who was also compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, desired that they do justice while loving mercy. They built a tabernacle, think mobile temple, with imagery that recreated Eden down to an entrance facing toward the east and armed priests guarding the door like the cherubim in Eden, perhaps as a reminder that those who enter the tabernacle are leaving the land of the lost and entering the garden of life. And in the middle was yet another ark. Once again, animals die to cover the shame and guilt of their sin. This was not a frivolous or a bloodthirsty act. It was the deepest act of penance. An animal was life. It was wealth. It was status and power. This was an act of humility that reminded them once again that the wages of sin is death. But the law and order that was meant to bring life brought judgment and sorrow. These covenant people kept doing non-covenant things, and if they wanted to live under the blessing and protection of God, there was a covenant. On their way to the new Eden of the promised land, the serpent stayed at their heel literally and spiritually. At one point, God sent a punishment of fiery serpents after the people rebelled. Surely they remembered their history and understood this message. Moses made an image of this curse that he lifted up so that those who turned their eyes toward it could be healed. And we'll hear more about this lifting up later. The entire generation of people set free from Egypt never made it to the promised land. Moses himself never made it to the promised land because he broke God's boundaries. Chaos is a hard habit to break. It took new people with a new honor of God and appreciation of covenant to be entrusted with the care of the new land of promise. This is Eden 4.0. That went bad too. God had warned Moses in Deuteronomy 31:16. You are about to lie down with your fathers. This people will arise, and they will play the harlot with the strange gods of the land, into the midst of which they are going, and they will forsake me, and they will break my covenant which I have made with them. In their now chaotic New Eden, God gave them judges, heroes that would lead them. But the people still ended up doing what was right in their own eyes, language that echoes what happened in Eden and at Babel. The book of Judges is a series of episodes that just play on repeat. Worship other gods, do terrible sins, welcome chaos into your land, get ruled by other kings who serve other gods. But then God in his mercy would send his Spirit to move over the troubled chaos of his people and raise up a new judge, a deliverer. And then repeat. The people eventually begged for a king, one with flesh like everybody else had. Maybe that was their problem. So God gave them kings. He established boundaries for these kings and their kingdoms because he is a God of order. And he sent his Spirit to aid them. The Bible is clear on this. Their first king broke the boundaries quickly. It wasn't that Saul didn't know. He did what was right in his own eyes to make a name for himself by deciding right and wrong on his terms. God's prophet Samuel said to Saul, "You're not a man after God's own heart. You love chaos and reject order. God does not." The second king, David, was a man after God's own heart, at least when he was installed as king. He talked about arrogant men who were like beasts. Yet he too gave in to sin, and he broke the boundaries around his life. Like Eve, he saw something beautiful, same words from Genesis 1. But it was also forbidden, and he still took it, and his is a legacy that left a trail of chaos. He passed this on to his son Solomon, who started well but finished badly. Solomon even built a new sacred space, a new Eden with a new temple that would be defiled through its existence before it was destroyed by invaders when God tore the kingdom from yet another who followed his own heart instead of God's. If David thought some men were beasts, Solomon wrote, "Concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts." Still, God, who's rich in mercy, had made yet another covenant. He told David that it was through David that a Messiah would come and establish a kingdom that would endure forever, an Eden that would never end. Yes, sin has its consequences, but it does not control the plans of God. Bad years followed. Yahweh, whose name was to be made great in all of the earth by his covenant people, had his name smeared and dishonored over and over again. The kingdom divided. Eventually, God's people were sent east into nations whose gods they had followed. The formless and void of Genesis 1 is repeated only once in the Old Testament, and it's here. When Babylon destroyed Judah, Jeremiah wrote, "I looked on the earth, and it was formless and void," exactly the same words from Genesis 1. God did not send the chaos of the deep to destroy them. He did send the Leviathan of Syria, the behemoth of Babylon, the tannin or dragon of Nebuchadnezzar. Read Jeremiah 51. They would take them to the home of gods and kings that they had chosen over their God and their king. Treason has never been treated lightly. And yet Daniel is at peace among the beasts, and his friends are not forsaken in the fire. God is still near. The prophets had warned them. Daniel had seen beast after beast, chaos creatures coming out of a watery darkness and coming for God's people. Ezekiel wrote the 4 judgments coming upon Jerusalem, which included the beasts, as well as sword and famine and pestilence. Ezekiel says in chapter 34, "Those who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces," going back to the covenant with Abraham. Jeremiah talks about the house of Israel and Judah breaking the covenant that God had made with their fathers. Jeremiah also says that the house of Israel was now uncircumcised in heart. Isaiah 24:5 says the earth is polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, and broke the everlasting covenant. This is not good news. But since Yahweh was faithful, the prophets, that is, the speakers for Yahweh, had always promised hope. As God's Spirit moved the prophets, they said, shockingly, that God's glory was still with those exiles in the east, and that when it returned there would be a new revelation, greater than God's appearance to Moses on another holy mountain. A Redeemer was coming, a Savior, one in whom chaos would be defeated and order would once again return. This Messiah would bring freedom, life, blessing, joy, and peace as a result of the salvation he offered. Isaiah 43 says that the beast and the dragons and, wait for it, the owls will honor him. Daniel wrote, "Before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Jeremiah 31, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." Isaiah again, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." This, by the way, is a section that Jesus will later quote. "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Daniel wrote in chapter 9 that an anointed one, a prince, shall make a strong covenant with many, and he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. The classic passage from Isaiah 53 reads, "Surely he, that is Jesus, has borne our grief and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, every one, to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, that is Jesus, the iniquity of us all." And finally, Isaiah once again, even earlier in his prophecies, had said this, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." Sounds a lot like creation. "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." This person arrives to offer a new and final covenant that fixes everything that was broken, fulfills the law and the prophets, and takes all the threads of the story and weaves them together in one unified person. This is Jesus, the Christ, the perfect God and perfect man, the Creator manifesting as his creation, the lawgiver become the law keeper, the covenant keeper taking the place of the covenant breaker, the Lord in whom there is no chaos, darkness, death, or sin, taking all of them upon himself and displaying his triumphant power so that we know, once and for all, that we do not have to fear them. So going back to Genesis, in language taking us back to Genesis 1, the Spirit of God moves over Mary, bringing life where there was not life, making her womb a sacred space and telling her what to name her son. God's Spirit fluttered like a dove in the beginning of all things, according to the rabbis. Now God's Spirit descends like a dove on Jesus. He is the God of the first creation, who now brings the new creation. Going back to Adam, Mary's son Jesus is now the new and better Adam. In his temptation in the desert, he's cast out, similar to what happened to Adam and Cain. He's cast out into the wilderness with the wild beasts, and he takes dominion, not just over the beasts of the field, but over the beasts of John's apocalypse. Fallen humanity had headed east over and over. Jesus draws wise men back from the east from the moment he was born. And he'll make a new heaven and a new earth, turning the entire world into his sacred space. The curse from Eden will be reversed. They shall not labor in vain, nor bear children for calamity. Going back to Noah, Jesus walks on water and commands the deep. He is the ark that preserves us when the deep threatens to overwhelm us. The command to be fruitful and multiply in the covenants with Adam and Noah is now a spiritual one. Go and make disciples, bear the fruit of the Spirit. Going back to Abraham, he is the God who becomes the torn carcass to pay the full penalty for Abraham's broken covenant. And he is the blessing for the world promised through Abraham. Going back to Moses, the Egypt that would have killed Moses now shelters the new and better Moses. He's the eternal Passover lamb, under whose blood eternal death has no power. He's the final and perfect sacrifice that silences the altars of Moses. He's the substitutionary atonement, not just for most sins, but for all sins. He is lifted up on the cross like the bronze serpent in the desert, an image bearer of the curse that would now bring healing and life. He withstood testing in the barren desert from the Satan, the greatest bringer of chaos and sin. He met with his people on the holy mountain in power and glorious majesty on the Mount of Transfiguration. It's the dawning of the day hinted at by the prophetic lamp in the darkness. Going back to David and Solomon, Jesus is now the king who literally has God's heart. And he's the true temple, and he'll make his dwelling place in us so that we can become the temple of God. Going back to the Old Testament prophets, he was the Messiah who could offer a lasting deliverance, not from bondage to people, but from chaos and the destruction of sin and death. He brought order into a disordered and broken world, healing the sick, casting out demons, bringing the dead to life, trading beauty for ashes. He's not merely a light in the darkness. He is the day star, the light bringer, rising to make us covenant keepers in our new covenant hearts.